Hey, welcome back everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a book that was not necessarily a fun read, but was a read that I would categorize as an important read. And that's Jesus and John Wayne by Kristin Dumais. This book's thesis is in the tagline, and it's about how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. And it shows kind of a short history, kind of on like the 100-year time scale, maybe going back a little further than that, but pretty recent events up until the election of Trump. Ties together a lot of disparate events, showing a continual theme of sexism, racism, patriarchy, essentially just like overt political values and power being kind of used as the guiding line for choices in the evangelical church. I think this book is super important for everyone to read. With that said, it doesn't feel like a history book as much as a propaganda book. And before that is upsetting to you, especially if you agree with the author's thesis, I'm not saying that it's a propaganda book in a negative sense, but more like this is written as a manifesto. The author has a very clear point that they want to get across, and they're going to be very particular about picking out every single event that they can to highlight their narrative. They're not going to present any contrasting evidence at all to try and hurt their thesis. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Not every book has to be this sterile, unopinionated representation of the facts. I think that this is an incredibly emotionally charged issue full of a lot of hurt, sadness, trauma, and wrongs that need to be repented, forgiven, and recompensed, really. And I don't think that, I guess that's all just to say that, like, me calling this a book of propaganda is not to dismiss it. Like I said, I think this is a book that people, especially evangelicals, should read. But I do think it's important to go into it realizing you're going to feel really bad about your faith, but this is also written as a manifesto to make you feel really bad about your faith, and there is not really much, if any, contrasting evidence to hurt the author's thesis. They're being very particular about picking that out. That's important. A lot of these examples show a lot of very famous Christian leaders doing the same thing to promote their ends. And so sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, and we can't all be mature adults, or not even mature adults. We can't all just be divorced emotionally from an issue and try to present this flat, fact-based narrative. The author goes somewhat sequentially through the period of history, showing this rather quick erosion of Christian values being replaced by, for lack of a better word, conservative values, and generally the worst parts of conservatism that I think a lot of people who would now tag themselves as conservative would probably dismiss. At least I would hope so. I'm kind of afraid to talk about this because this book is packed with so many stories of people being abused by leaders that were entrusted to protect them and did the opposite. Instead, used their position for their own power and gain and abuse. And so any minor quibbles that I have with the book, I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about, because I don't want to be dismissive of the kind of overarching narratives and stories that are in this book. I grew up essentially in the evangelical church. For the most part, that's where my parents took us to church at. And so a lot of these stories were kind of familiar, but I would say a lot of times there was like a second layer to these stories that I didn't know about that kind of made them even grosser and a little bit more disgusting than the little bit I knew. There was a few stories that I already kind of knew about. A big one was Mark Driscoll. I already knew a lot about that just because I had cousins that went to his church and friends that listened to his podcast. And I remember, fortunately, this, I guess, pat myself on the back for a second. I remember even as a young teen hearing Driscoll's messages and thinking that there was just something gross and off about this preacher. As an adult, I haven't really participated much in the evangelical church, but that's always going to be a part of my childhood history and I guess the faith of my parents. And so I don't want to say that I'm a different group of Christian than those people, so I can ignore the wrongs they do. I think in general, Christians are really quick to create denominations as in-groups and out-groups, partly for the sake of not being responsible for the wrongs that people commit in Jesus' name. Apologies if you can hear my dog chewing her chew toy down here. She's really going to town. I think she's having a good time. That said, I would caution anyone who is a newer evangelical reading this to try and go into this with someone else that can maybe provide a little bit more context. Like I said, this book is very much trying to prove a point, and I think it does so quite successfully, but I do think that there is probably a broader and larger context where you can't necessarily paint the entire evangelical movement as 100% evil. And I think it's difficult to read this book and not come away with this feeling that the entire movement should just be, tossed out the window. So I would say I would definitely recommend people read this book, especially people who have been in the evangelical church for a long time. It's probably going to make a lot of victims feel validated in the abuse that was perpetrated on them. And I think it's going to challenge some people who sat idly by and didn't really notice or were complicit in abuse that was being done. If the American evangelical movement is to continue forward in a meaningful way, I do think it needs to spend some time addressing this and looking at how this weird phenomenon of politics, capitalism, and power morphed their movement into this huge weapon of abuse. And that's not to say that that's all the evangelical church did. I know I keep tempering my comments and not doing that to be dismissive. I'm not doing that even to necessarily defend them. I'm doing that because I think that the real story is complicated and messy. And though the story in Jesus and John Wayne is very much real, I don't think there was any falsity. If there were any lies, I could not find them. And granted, I didn't look for them, but Kristin felt like a very reliable narrator that was presenting this case to try and bring about healing, not to try and bring about simple destruction. Kind of all over the place in this review. This was an emotional book to read, even though I'm not super involved in the evangelical church now. It's what I grew up in, and I kind of lived through a lot of the stories that were told in this book. And even if you're not part of the evangelical church, it's such a huge, powerful movement that you're going to be affected even if you are trying to not participate in Christianity. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Do you think I want people to read this book, but I want people to read this book with not an eye of condemnation and damnation, for their Christian brothers and sisters, specifically brothers, because let's be real, most of the abusers in this story were men because they benefited the most from the abuse. But I want people to read this with an eye of reconciliation, redemption, forgiveness, repentance, and recompense. I mean, repentance and recompense kind of go hand in hand, but I think too often we confuse repentance and confession as kind of one and the same, where if you say that you did a bad thing, then people are obligated to forgive you. And those are separate acts. And I think that both confession and repentance, which probably could almost be better understood as recompense, needs to happen from a lot of this. I would be lying if I said I was hopeful about this. We're coming up on another election year soon, with the front runner for the Republican Party being Donald Trump. So I guess I'm gonna pray. I'm gonna pray that things get better, because I don't want this to continue. And me just removing myself from the evangelical church doesn't necessarily like remove myself from the broader like umbrella of Christianity. So, I'm still pulling for them. I'm hoping that, things get better. So yeah, that's my thoughts.